dollar. Dirt and money, no soul. Had to go and get it, ain't no time to kick it. Got a stack of flip for my foes. Dollar. Please tell me you can hear me. Don't turn your back and don't neglect me. Just let me know if you need me. Dollar. Let me watch out for my partners. Keep my money long, get my team strong. Let me run away from my problems.
Yo, what's good, original groove?
Just keep it simple.
It's your boy DJ New Kid, your girl.
Sierra Nicole.
Back on the channel with another
Kid and C original.
No. Welcome back to the channel, man. Hey, we got another Mr. Ballen video for y'all today. We got top 3 impossible places people. Hopefully y'all don't hear that. If y'all do, we apologize. Hey, we right by the station.
Right by it.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Where they only put the police by the, you know what I'm saying, by the suburban spots.
They hate the police.
I don't know who that is.
Where is the police? Oh, never mind. I know the police station.
You work
yeah,
by
I said I know it.
Well, that's we on. Okay. But we got top 3 impossible places people were found missing 411. Were found. Didn't say
found. So
missing 411.
Okay.
Missing information. 411. What's the 411? What's the info?
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah.
Girl, you know
all
y'all girls used to be up on what's the 411 girl?
No. It's all like that.
You're so L7.
Okay.
Oh man, with that being said, man, before we get into it, make sure you check out the links in the description box down below. You already know where to go, man. If you want to first support, all the information is down below. Also, every single time we salute to the coming of the day.
Salute to you.
We highly appreciate y'all, man. Go ahead and run us up. Also, if you enjoyed today's video, lock it in with a thumbs up and let us know. But again, it's top 3 impossible places people were found. This is part 13. Hey, like we always say, we're going to get to every part, so just slow your roll.
40 years after a U.S. Army soldier went missing on this desolate Alaskan island, researchers make a startling discovery that changes everything about that case. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak up behind the like button and viciously rear naked choke them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On October 9th, 2010, 2-year-old Rowan Griffin was in the backseat of the car next to his 2 older siblings, and his father was driving the car. And they were on their way to this big family party at Rowan's grandparents' house. They lived in Richmond, New Hampshire, which is a pretty rural part of New Hampshire, and their house was literally in the woods. You had to go down this really long driveway to get to it, and it was this single-story home where they'd cleared out all the trees in the backyard to kind of clear a space to have these awesome cookouts for family get-togethers. And so Rowan, his 2 siblings, and his dad, they get to the entrance of the driveway that's going to bring them up to the house, and they can already tell there's tons of people here because there's cars lining the driveway all the way out to the street. And so they make their way up the driveway, and sure enough, right in the backyard is just a sea of adults and teenagers and kids. It's this huge family reunion, and Rowan and his 2 siblings just take off running to go play with their cousins. And so for the next couple of hours, the kids were just running around having a great time, and the adults are having a good time. And at some point, the adults started to notice, after the fact, they would say they noticed this, they started to notice Rowan was chasing a cat. There was a cat that lived at the grandparents' house, and he loved the cat, and he was chasing it all around the backyard. And at some point, Rowan ran into the woods to chase after this cat. And a number of adults saw him do that, but it was like mob mentality, where they each thought somebody else was watching Rowan. They were not trying to be negligent. They just figured there's so many people here, what can go wrong? In a very short period of time, Mr. Griffin realizes he can't find his son. And so he goes to the kids and he's like, hey, have you seen Rowan? And they're like, oh yeah, I think he was chasing a cat. I think he was over there. And then Mr. Griffin asks the adults and they say the same thing. Yeah, he's chasing a cat. I think he was over there. And after looking around for him and everybody basically saying he was chasing this cat and not being able to find him, he just started yelling to the group, hey, everybody stop for a second. I can't find Rowan. Everyone's telling me he's chasing a cat. Well, then can you tell me where he went? I don't know where he is. And pretty quickly they realize he's not in the house. He's not in the backyard. He's not at the end of the driveway. He's not in any of the cars. He's not here. And very quickly, the group started yelling for Rowan. They're running out into the woods. They're looking for him. And Mr. Griffin is like, I don't know how long he's been gone for. And so he calls 911 right then and there. He's not taking any chances. And so the police come out and they launch this huge search. And then all these locals in the area that had ATVs and four-wheelers, they came out and they're driving around the forest looking for Rowan. Everybody's yelling for him. There's hundreds of people out there. But as the sun started to fade, they still hadn't found him. They had found no indication of where he went. They assumed he made it out into the forest because the last sign of him was he was chasing a cat into the forest potentially, but they really didn't know. And so finally the sun does go down that night and they have to postpone the search until first light the next morning. And you can only imagine how horrible that was for Rowan's parents as they're sitting inside that night wondering what's happening to their 2-year-old son who's just out in the woods by himself.
And that's one of the situations, like, especially when you have like such a large gathering. I wonder was there any other kids around his age? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because there should have been a barrier, especially when y'all do. It should be a location where the kids have to stay.
Right.
Because especially being out there in the woods like they were, and how much feel and you can just go and be lost. And nobody's really paying attention because everybody's out there to have a good time.
Right.
Nobody is the designated watcher, so nobody feels as though they should keep an eye on you know what I mean?
Especially if it's like people feel like, especially if it's not their child.
Exactly.
They feel like,
and I feel that.
But I will say, well, I mean, like you could say what you would have done or whatever, or what you would do in those type of situations, but just personally, like if I see a child running towards the woods, that's a red flag. No, you know what I'm saying?
But what I'm saying is, how many times have they really been out there? And maybe he
does
like
it often.
Yeah. Like this is his house, this is his yard. Obviously,
yeah.
But like you said, it's like they probably feel like, well, it's not my child, so I saw him like, all right, cool, wondering. But as a parent, you do need to keep an eye on your kids at all times, or have an indication of where your kids, even if it's at your own house.
Very early the next morning, a whole bunch of volunteers went right back out into the woods to look for Rowan. There was this one particular group that wanted to look a little bit farther away than where everybody else was looking. They were going to be about 3+ miles away in this swamp. And so this group of searchers, they start walking into this swamp and they can tell right away that it's a very wet and deep swamp. They would take a step onto something that looked solid and they would sink 2-3 feet into the water. They all had waders on so they wouldn't get wet. But they were basically sludging through the swamp, and it was very thick. And at some point, they make their way through a clearing, and they see on a log what looks like a pair of children's shoes, or shoes for sure. They look small enough to be kids. And so they wade their way over, and they climb up onto this dry section of land, and they walk over, and sure enough, they're kids' shoes. And so they yell out for him a couple times, and then they stop to listen, and after a minute, they hear him call back. He's yelling, here! And they walk their way past this huge bush, and they look through, and they can't believe it. They see Rowan right in the middle of this bog of water. There is a tree that is right in the middle of this, and he's clutched onto the tree. He looks dry, he looks okay, and he's just standing on this island holding this tree. And so immediately the searchers jump right in the water, and they start wading their way out to this island where Rowan is, and the whole time they're going out there, the water's, up to their chest, and they're looking around, and it's at least that deep all the way around this thing, and they're looking up at the kid, and he's bone dry, and he's 2 years old, so they don't know if he knows how to swim or not. And so they're thinking to themselves, how did he get out here? But either way, they're like, let's just get the kid and bring him back to his parents.
Yeah.
And so they finally hop up onto this island and they kind of look over Rowan. He seems okay. They pick him up, they keep him out of the water, and they bring him back to land and back to his parents. Initially, Rowan's parents and the police and the searchers, everybody is just so happy that Rowan is alive that no one is asking any questions about, what happened and, what's the deal with you being found on that island? How'd you get out there? People are just leaving it alone. They're just happy he's here. But after the dust had settled, so to speak, Rowan's parents would ask him some questions. And they would say, what happened? How'd you get lost? And how'd you get on that island? And at first, Rowan was just not saying anything. But eventually he would say that there were cows out there. And he said that he was scared of the cows. And that's why he went to the island, because he wanted to get away from the cows. Now, there were no cows in that swamp or anywhere near where he was that night. So either he didn't see anything and he was hallucinating seeing animals at all, or he was mislabeling something else that he was seeing. But whatever he was seeing or believed he was seeing, it scared the heck out of him, and he would get really frightened when he would talk about these cows. But regardless of what he saw or didn't see, the million-dollar question is, how did he get out to that island? Because in order to get out to that island, for him, being a 2-year-old, being the size he was, he would have had to swim. The water was too deep all the way around the island, and he didn't know how to swim. But even if he had found a way to magically swim out to this island, why wasn't he wet? It's also worth noting this all took place just a few miles away from the infamous Bennington Triangle, which is this area in southern Vermont where there's been a whole string of people going missing under very mysterious circumstances.
My biggest thing is, how did he get there? Somebody had to be out there and picked him up. You think maybe somebody found him?
I have no clue. But if they found him, why would they just leave him?
Or maybe something was going on out there. Somebody picked him up, laid him there, and they couldn't get back to him.
Maybe.
Something was going on.
Something happened, because when he talked about this, or maybe he was just traumatized because, again, they did have to call off the search and until the next day.
Where was the cat?
Well, right.
No, I'm just also saying, where did the cat go?
Right, true, but
because that could be another clue to possibly what happened.
Yeah, I don't know, but yeah, that's sad. But I'm glad that he was found safe.
I think so. I think that story way deeper than.
Yeah.
In 1953, 11-year-old Jerry Monkman was considered a very frail child. He was skinnier than his peers, he was shorter than his peers, and he had a really bad case of asthma, which was a breathing condition that made doing anything physical really difficult. But despite his perceived fragility, he loved going outside, he loved hiking, and he was a proud member of the Boy Scouts. And so on April 25th of that year, Jerry was really excited when he found out his Boy Scout troop was offering a trip to the Rocky Mountain foothills to go camping and hiking for a weekend, and he jumped at the opportunity. So Jerry, his troop, and his troop leaders, they all pile in a van and they make their way up to the Rocky Mountains, and as soon as they get there, they go on this wickedly rugged hike up in the Teton Canyon, and about an hour into their trip, one of the troop leaders turns around and Jerry's gone. The troop leaders did not know how long he had been gone for, so they only searched for a couple of minutes before one of them ran down the mountain to try to get help. Soon the sheriff's department arrived, and 1,600 volunteers from the town that had heard about this, they all poured out onto the mountain, and they are combing across this mountain to find Jerry as quickly as possible. But after several hours, they couldn't find him, and people started to think the worst. And then just then, the bloodhound they had brought out to try to track his scent picked up Jerry's scent, and it starts taking off up the trail. And the handler of the dog tells everyone, hey, he's picked him up. We're going to find him. We're going to find him. And he thinks the dog's going to lead him to him, within a mile or so of where they are. But the dog just stays on a complete beeline for 6 hours. It just tracks straight north for 6 hours until it comes to this big swamp where it stops. Like, I found it. This is where it ends. This swamp was 12 miles away from where Jerry had gone missing. So the handler and the people that had followed this dog, they searched the swamp because even though they thought it was totally improbable that Jerry, this frail 11-year-old with asthma, would have maneuvered 12 miles uphill through rugged terrain to the swamp, they still felt like they needed to search it. So they searched the swamp there wasn't anything there. And so the dog handler's thinking, okay, my dog must have made a mistake. And so he gives the scent again to the dog, thinking the dog will turn and start heading back towards where Jerry had gone missing. But instead, his dog basically just reconfirms that, nope, this is where the scent brought me. I'm still right. And so the dog handler and everybody else that had made this long, treacherous 12-mile journey up to the swamp, they just decided that the dog must have made a mistake and the kid could never have been here. The next morning at 8 a.m., an 8-year-old boy named David was riding his horse about 30 miles away from where Jerry had gone missing. And he happened to be looking over at the tree line, and a boy stumbles out of the tree line and waves to him. And so David goes over, and it turns out it's Jerry Monkman. Jerry would just tell David that he needs to get back to his group. And David would say, what are you doing out here? And Jerry just said, I don't really know. I need to get back to my group. I was with a group yesterday, and I need to get back to them. And apparently David asked him, well, how did you get here if you were with them yesterday? And all Jerry could say was, I fell asleep under a tree. I don't know. When word got back to the searchers that they had found Jerry and they had found him 30 miles away, they couldn't believe it. The day before, it had been unbelievable that he could have traveled 12 miles to that swamp. Like, literally unbelievable. They didn't believe it.
How did he get there, one? Two, how did he get, what made him separate from the group?
He said he was asleep.
He so happened to fall asleep under a tree. But I'm saying, as they were hiking, what made him? Did he probably get tired as they was hiking? Because keep in mind he has asthma.
But still, he doesn't even remember walking to even get to where he was.
He just remember falling asleep under a tree.
He couldn't have done it. And now clearly he's traveled at least 30 miles to have been found by David where he was found. And that's 30 miles as the crow flies, meaning overhead air miles, 30 miles. The reality is when you're walking in the wilderness, you don't walk in straight lines.
Nope.
You make turns and you go left, there's switchbacks. And the area he must have gone through over those 30 miles is all unmarked. It's this rugged, hilly, awful, unmarked terrain. So for sure, he probably covered 40 plus miles to get there. And so the police asked him, how did you do this? How did you cover the distance you covered in such a short amount of time? And Jerry would say he just remembers sleeping under a tree and then waking up, and he would see animals poking their heads around from behind different trees. And he didn't know what kind of animals they were, but they were watching him, and he was worried they were going to hurt him, but they didn't. And he said he was able to just keep walking, and he would keep sleeping under these trees, and he kept seeing these animals that were watching him, and he just kept saying, they never hurt me. They never hurt me. And so obviously this did not answer any of the questions that the investigators were looking to answer, and they just felt like, okay, maybe he's in shock, and we can ask him at another time. But the theory became like, well, then he must have been abducted to have covered this distance. But that begs the question, who's capable of moving an 11-year-old that much distance in such a short amount of time? We're talking about a 30-hour window, moving potentially 50 plus miles, lugging an 11-year-old around. And then even if there was someone or something that was capable of lifting up an 11-year-old and maneuvering them that much distance in such a short amount of time, well, to what end? Right. Why would they do that? Why was Jerry then maneuvered to the swamp and then maneuvered to where he was found? It doesn't make any sense.
What's your thoughts?
No, you go.
I believe he was brought to where he was by an animal. I believe he fell asleep. He was solo dolo.
Yes.
Animals are very protective of children.
Yeah, they are.
Because it's something about them that they sense the innocent.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And I feel as though the troop kept walking. He was still asleep. Mm-hmm. So an animal came by, noticed there was no one around. Yeah. And there was this little kid passed out. No, the animal, probably a bear or something, came, nudged him. He didn't wake up. And so they picked him up and took him until he eventually woke up. Yeah. And then he kept passing out. Maybe it's because
at one point, I feel like they probably did take him to the swamp. Yeah. Because that's what the dog picked up. He was adamant about that. No, he was here at one point. I know for sure he was here at one point. Now, if he's not here now, then he's been moved.
They crossed him across the swamp.
Across the swamp. And that's why he was able to pick up on his scent. I do agree with you with that. And like I was saying earlier, I feel like as they were hiking, keep in mind he has asthma, he probably got tired, kind of weak, and kind of just probably, sat down, passed out under a tree. And if he was short of breath, he probably couldn't really relay, like, hey, I can't, as they were hiking. I do feel like that's what happened. Yeah, but I'm just so glad he was found safe and stuff.
One of the most remote places in the world is Boulder Island in Alaska. It's 2/3 of the way to Russia along the Aleutian chain of islands. The nearest inhabited island is about 50 miles away. The weather on Boulder Island is pretty brutal, especially during the winter, and there's no electricity there. In 1944, the United States Army decided they wanted to send 5 of their soldiers to monitor the weather station on Boulder Island. That was like the one thing the island was used for. And so one of the people that was sent on this assignment was a guy by the name of Bud Houston. Bud was born in Wisconsin and worked in a shipyard before enlisting in the Army in 1942. He was a big hunter and outdoorsman, and so the prospect of living on this kind of desolate Alaskan island really appealed to him, and he was excited about the assignment. In October of that year, Bud was flown out to Boulder Island, and he met with the other 4 soldiers that were going to be living on the island with him. It was going to be those 5 on the island. No one else is there. And they quickly learned their job of monitoring the weather station was a very low effort job. And so they could do all of their tasks over the course of the day pretty easily. And it freed up a lot of time for them to explore the island. And that would actually become their favorite pastime because there really wasn't much else to do there except explore the island. And so very quickly they became very familiar with the whole island because it wasn't that big. It was about maybe 2.5 miles wide by 4.5 miles long. On March 3rd, 1945, so 5 months after they've arrived on Boulder Island, so by now they know every square inch of the island, they're very comfortable here, they had to do a routine patrol around the weather station. This was something they did multiple times a week, so very routine. And all 5 of them are sitting in the weather station, and Bud says he'll do it. So Bud gets his rifle, and he heads outside to do this patrol. And the other 4 are just sitting in the weather station, and after about an hour, they realize Bud hasn't come back yet. And this patrol does not take more than 20 minutes. And so they step outside to see if he's out there, and the weather at the time was very mild. There's no snow on the ground, it's not very cold, it's not very windy, and the visibility this night was pretty good. And so they're looking out over the island, and the island has no trees. At the very far end, at the opposite end of where the weather station is, there's one significant sized mountain. But short of that, it's not particularly mountainous. So from their perspective, they could look out over the island and basically see everything, and they don't see him anywhere. At first, they were not that worried about it because they figure, you know what, he knows what he's doing, he's been here so long, he's probably just out exploring or something. But they decided they would go look for him. They go down to the water, he's not down there. They walk all around the far side of the island, they can't find him. And so by the time they get back to the weather station, they were like, we have to tell the command that we've lost him. So they radio back to higher command and they say, we don't know where he went. He went out on patrol and we didn't hear anything. And now he's gone. And so a whole bunch of reinforcements came out to the island to look on foot with the other 4 soldiers, as well as planes and helicopters. And for 2 days, they looked all over that island for Bud, and they couldn't find him. And you got to remember that there's very few places you could possibly even go on the island that they wouldn't be able to look and see you. And so everyone started to think he must have jumped into the water or fallen into the water because there's nowhere for him to hide on the island. And so after a couple of days, they were so sure that it was just not possible for him to be on the island that they called the search off and they said he must have fallen into the water. Fast forward 40 years to 1988, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was studying birds on Boulder Island, and they made this amazing discovery. This crew had set up their camp at 1,600 feet of elevation on the one large mountain on the far side of the island, basically on the opposite end of the island from the weather station. And one of the crew members happened to just walk around one of the boulders, and they looked down and there was this little tiny crevice between the boulder and the ground, and he thought he saw something inside of it. And he got down and he looked and he realized there was a skeleton that had been kind of crammed into this tiny little tight space. And the skeleton had a military uniform on. It had been kind of balled up, but there was a uniform on what was left of the skeleton, and there was also a rifle that had been jammed down in there as well. And it would turn out to be Bud Houston. So why did Bud say he was going to go outside and do that patrol, which really just meant walking around the immediate vicinity of the weather station? You're certainly not traveling very far. Why did he say he was going to do that and then walk 4.5 miles to the other end of the island and then climb up 1,500 feet to the top of this mountain. But even if he had a reason to be over there, why would he then force himself into this little tiny crevice? If he was looking for shelter, well, the weather was incredibly mild. It would not have been life-threatening to be out in the elements, at least not that first night or even that second night. And he knows the island like the back of his hand. He probably had a little bit more time. He probably could have found a better place for shelter than this awful little crevice. But if he was at a place where he was seeking shelter under these boulders instead of just walking back to the weather station and getting real shelter, then he had to have been in an emergency situation. That's the only way that makes sense. But if he was in an emergency situation, he would know that his responsibility is not just to survive, it's also to be found again and to make sure you're not obscured underneath a boulder so no one can find you. This island, it was like the easiest place to be found. There's no trees. There was helicopters overhead and planes, and there's all these people. It's a small space. All he had to do was not be under the boulder 24/7. Maybe during the day when the weather let up, roll out from under the boulder, let yourself be found. But that's not what happened. What probably happened is Bud somehow got crammed into that little tiny crevice almost immediately after he left the weather station to do that patrol. But logically speaking, he would not do that to himself. So someone else had to do it. But all the other people on the island were in the weather station at the time this would have been happening. So it really makes you wonder, what happened when he walked outside of that weather station? Who or what did he see, and what did they do to him? Unfortunately, we'll probably never know. So that's going to do it, guys. I hope you enjoyed.
That's the only one. That's the only one of like these 3 stories that I'm like, I really have like no clue, no words, because how? That's the, like how? Yeah. How did a grown man, how he described, how it, looked, the size of it. How did you get in there like that? And what made you even walk that far when all you had to do was patrol,
I want to say somebody else was on that island.
Had to be.
And somebody probably killed him and stuffed him where they can't find him. Yeah.
But
military.
Why?
Because it's military. Why are y'all on that island and then y'all have to patrol it? It's the reason why y'all was there.
I thought that they were like doing like the weather, like doing something with the. I know. I'm just being.
No, I'm saying like.
I know.
So it's a real.
I know.
And I want to say
I know.
It had to be somebody had to be on there for you to be in that type of a space and the way you were, and because it was like somebody killed you and wanted to hide the body. And maybe people had been watching that island for the longest and just waiting for the right time to get one of y'all.
Yeah.
And they knew they weren't going to be able to get all of y'all.
And I'm wondering, I don't want to jump to, assumptions or whatever, but possibly, and the reason why, maybe they was going to do like one by one. After that situation, they probably called off.
Yeah, they were like, no, we can't do it because it was too.
Yeah.
Now it's too many people out here.
Right.
We can't attack the way we want to. That's military. That one's very mysterious.
That's sad.
Yeah.
And 40 years later.
40 years later. 40.
Wow.
So
it happened in 1942. Was he even
dead when y'all? If y'all could have found him, if y'all really truly scoured the whole, obviously y'all didn't.
Keep in mind again the area, like where it was at. Like no one would think that a grown man would be able to fit it. Like you know what I'm saying? Like
you still have to look every inch.
I get that, but sometimes you're human. You miss, they even had helicopters. So obviously wherever he was at, there was no possible way where you could see him. Like visible, he was invisible.
But with that being said, man, y'all let us know y'all thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below. Let us know how y'all feel about it, man. But as always, y'all know how it goes. I do go by the name of Kid This Is. We are.
Had to go and get it, ain't no time to kick it. Got a stack of flip for my foes. Dollar. Please tell me you can hear me. Don't turn your back and don't neglect me. Just let me know if you need me. Dollar. Let me watch out for my partner.